And we are back, once again talking about the Seattle Kraken expansion draft coming up this summer. And now with the NHL trade deadline a week in the past, these rosters look pretty close to what they will look like when that expansion draft does roll around. Now, there still could be some changes, especially on teams that aren't looking to make the playoffs this season, but for the most part, those trades and changes to these rosters will be pretty few and far between from here on out. Now, for some weird reason, it doesn't really seem like the goal has been, at least for the majority of the 30 teams that will be a part of the expansion draft, to set up their roster in such a way that they present at least a couple of good options for Seattle to pick from when that time comes. But during the trade deadline, the Florida Panthers were one of the few teams that went much more in the positive direction there, at least as far as Seattle is concerned anyway. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. For the Panthers, outside of a COVID scare early on, this season has gone about as well as they possibly could have dreamed that it would go. Of course, it comes in the 1 year where it can't make much of a difference as far as attendance numbers are concerned, although this is still Florida, but it still is a good sign for their future. The Panthers have been able to keep pace with both Carolina and Tampa Bay in their division as this season has gone along, and as a result look to be one of those three teams that are pretty much locked to be in the playoffs. And while none of that really matters all that much to Seattle, the fact that it made Florida buyers at the trade deadline definitely seems to have panned out in Seattle's favor when it comes to the expansion draft. Because the Panthers were one of the more active teams and have picked up a number of players that could be very draftable come that time. Now, as far as the Panthers' protection list is concerned, I'm not sure that their moves at the trade deadline really changed things all that much. For one, I still do think it looks pretty likely that they'll be going the 7-3 protection route, and on top of that, their protection list coming into the season, most of those guys are still on the team and will probably still be getting their protection spot. But if there are any changes to this protection list from what people might have expected coming into the season, they would have happened on the forward end, where guys like Jonathan Huberdeau, Alexander Barkov, and Patrick Hornqvist will all very much be protected, just like everyone probably expected. Of course, Huberdeau does have a no movement clause, so he would have to be protected, but I don't think that really matters much as they would protect him with or without it. Now, at 34, Hornqvist is getting a little bit on the older end, but he still is very much producing for them with 29 points in 40 games, which is good for fourth on the team. Plus, with just 2 more years on a contract that really doesn't look all that bad, there isn't a ton of incentive for them to try and move on from him. At least not just yet, anyway. Of course, Carter Verhaeghe is also certainly lock, and I do also expect that Frank Vatrano and Alexander Wenberg would probably also both get protected. And then that 7th slot I do think is pretty up in the air at the moment, although this is where one of the changes comes for me because I do think at the moment Sam Bennett probably has the inside track to get it, as they did just give up a 2nd round pick in Emil Heineman in order to pick him up from the Flames during the trade deadline. But either Anthony Duclair or Noel Acciari, who I think originally would have been in that spot, could certainly also end up getting it. Of course, also probably worth mentioning here on the forward end, and one of the couple of things I missed during my recap of the trade deadline, is the fact that Henrik Borgstrom, who is somebody that some people are looking at as a potential option for the Kraken from the Panthers originally, went to the Chicago Blackhawks as part of the deal that brought both Lucas Carlsson and Lucas Wallmark to the team. Wallmark being another guy they could look at the forward end from the Panthers as it stands right now. On the defensive end, though, things there are pretty straightforward, and not a whole lot has changed, at least when it comes to the players that are likely to be protected, as all 3 of Aaron Ekblad, Keith Yandel, and Mackenzie Weegar are very likely to be protected. Of course, there have been some notable changes to who that leaves exposed, but we'll get to that in just a minute. As far as protected goaltender is concerned, well, Sergei Bobrovsky has a no movement clause, so he'd have to waive that in order to not be the protected goalie, but even if he didn't waive it, I think he's probably the protected guy here, although Chris Driedger has looked pretty impressive in his time this season. Though I probably should mention here before I get any comments about it, that much like Owen Tippett on the forward end, Spencer Knight, who is a promising prospect in goal for them, will be exempt from the expansion draft. But as we move now into talking about some of the guys that could be available for the Kraken to select from the Panthers, I want to start with a couple of guys that I've actually already talked about in previous videos in this series, starting with potentially one of the better options that the Kraken could have from the Panthers if he is left exposed in Sam Bennett. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on Bennett because, again, I did already talk about him when he was one of my favorite players for selection from the Calgary Flames back when I did that video, before he got traded, obviously. But again, real quick with him, at 24, he is a young center who plays a strong physical game. And while he has had some issues scoring consistently over the last couple of years, with just 14 points in 39 games last season, on 4 goals and 10 assists, which he's equaled exactly in 39 games so far this year, he plays a good two-way game with strong possession metrics, and again, a willingness to throw his body around. Plus, in the one game he has played for the Panthers, he does have 2 assists and 5 hits, so if nothing else, he at least had a pretty good debut for them. But if you do want a little bit more details about him, I will leave a link down in the description below to the Calgary Flames episode where I talked a little bit more about him. There will also be a link to the Chicago Blackhawks episode because Lucas Wallmark is another player that could be an option here that I've already talked about. Now, given some of the other options that the Kraken will now have from the Panthers, I'm not sure that Wallmark is a leading candidate to get selected here, but again, another young center that could find his way to Seattle. But there are a couple of guys on the forward end that have been part of this Panthers roster all along that could offer pretty good options for the Kraken, both of which could also end up getting that 7th protection slot, but again, for now, I have Sam Bennett there. Sticking with the theme, though, of younger forwards with a decent amount of NHL experience already, the one guy I could see a pretty good argument for getting that protection slot over Sam Bennett even at the moment would be Anthony Duclair. At the age of 25, the former 3rd-round pick left-shotted winger has played in at least part of 7 different NHL seasons, in that time playing in 385 games where he has 181 points on 85 goals and 96 assists. And with 19 points in 32 games this season, and especially the 40 points in 66 games last year with 23 goals, he does offer quite a bit more when it comes to points production than Sam Bennett would. The issue with him scoring-wise, though, has been consistency, because while he has had a couple of 20-goal seasons and one 19-goal season already in his career, he has had a couple of seasons with a little bit less scoring, especially in the 2016-17 season and the 2017-18 season, where he had 15 points and 23 points respectively. Plus, while again, even in a down year, he's probably producing at least as many, if not more points than Bennett, he does give a little bit to Bennett when it comes to the physical aspect of the game, or quite a bit, and also doesn't look quite as good when it comes to the possession metrics, especially with Corsi 4, with a career Corsi 4 percentage of 49.4, which isn't bad, but again, Sam Bennett looks quite a bit better there. But with all that having been said, you may have noticed as we've gone through these expansion lists and outlooks for different teams, that Seattle will have a much easier time finding players with defensive and physical aspects to their game, more so than guys with scoring upside. So Duclair could actually be a little bit more of an interesting option just from an opportunity cost perspective for the Kraken. Of course, again though, when it comes to choosing between Bennett and Duclair, if those are the top 2 guys that the Kraken were looking at, again, that decision would probably be made for them by the Panthers when it comes to their protection list, as one of those 2 is probably getting that 7th slot. And on top of that, at this current moment anyway, neither one of those guys has a contract for next season, with Bennett set to be a UFA and Duclair set to be an RFA. Meanwhile, though, the guy who, at least coming into the season anyway, seemed to have the inside track at that 7th protection slot does have a contract that goes through next year, that being Noel Acciari. The 29-year-old winger has played in 282 games across 6 NHL seasons in his career, with 69 career points on 42 goals and 27 assists. Which again is not a whole lot of points production, but the reason that he looked so good to potentially get a protection slot coming into the season is that last year was definitely his best career season, with 27 points in 66 games, including 20 goals, none of which came on the power play, which is pretty worth mentioning. Of course, much like Bennett though, the draw with Acciari has a lot more to do with the physical aspect of his game than it does his points production, where he has 705 career hits in those 282 games, including 221 hits in the 72 games he played in the 2018-19 season with the Bruins. And while, unlike Bennett, his Corsi and even Fenwick stats don't do him any favors, he does at least look pretty good when it comes to career expected plus-minus, even if a decent amount of those expected points based on possession have not turned into actual points so far. Now, Acciari probably wouldn't be my first pick here, again because of the availability elsewhere of the physical type of players, plus if Sam Bennett's available, he is quite a bit younger, so I'd probably take him instead. But if the Kraken do want to go all in on that physically dominating type of play, at least for their first season, if Bennett is protected, then Acciari probably would be their best bet here. Plus, he would cost them under $2 million next year, which is a pretty decent rate for what probably would be a third-line forward. As we move over now to the defensive end though, one of the guys who, at least coming into the season, certainly seemed to be one of the front runners for a favorite to be selected by the Kraken, and still certainly could be, would be Markus Nutivaara. Soon to be 27, Nutivaara has played in 263 games across 5 NHL seasons, where he has 67 points on 17 goals and 50 assists. So he can offer decent points for a depth defenseman, and while he doesn't offer quite as much on the physical end of things as a couple of those forwards we talked about, he still does play a pretty good two-way game as shown in his advanced stats, where he has an almost perfectly average 49.9 Corsi for percentage across the course of his career, and an 8.7 career expected plus-minus, which is pretty good on top of the fact that he's never been in the negatives outside of his first season in the league. So while he probably wouldn't make any headlines and certainly looks unlikely to ever be a top 2 type of defenseman, Nutivaara would be a solid selection for the Kraken to look at. But on the defensive end from the Panthers, there is one newcomer here who, at least to me, looks like the best option for the Kraken, at least if they were looking for a defenseman from the Panthers. And that would be Brandon Montour, who the Panthers recently liberated from the Sabres for a third-round pick. Now, the one upside that Nutivaara has over Montour is he is already under contract for next season, where he'll be paid $2.7 million. Meanwhile, Montour would be a UFA, at least at the moment. But assuming he is available, and especially if he gets extended, Montour could offer the Kraken a good amount of points production from the defensive end. The right-shotted defenseman, who just turned 27 recently, has played in 283 career games across 5 NHL seasons, where he has 106 points on 30 goals and 76 assists. Now, it is probably fair to mention with Montour that a lot more of that points production came in his second and third NHL seasons than it has over the last couple of years. Plus, he has seen the ice quite a bit more per game than Nutivaara has, but even outside of the points production, which would still seem to be higher than what Nutivaara would provide, he does have a little bit more of a physical aspect to his game, and does, for what it's worth, get in the way of quite a few more shots. Though his possession stats don't look quite as good as Nutivaara's do. But also, don't forget again that fact that he is a right-shotted defenseman also definitely plays in Montour's favor. Of course, if the Kraken still wanted to go the younger route and still wanted a defenseman, there are a couple of options here. First, there's Lucas Carlsson, who also came over from the Blackhawks and who I've also talked about before. And there is also the 24-year-old Gustav Forsling, who has 37 points in 154 career games, 10 of those 3 goals and 7 assists coming in 32 games this season. Both of which, though, are set to be RFAs at the end of the season, so whether or not they're actually viable options for selection probably hinges on whether or not they get extended before the draft. But there still is one other guy that actually could be one of the front runners for potential selection by the Kraken, and that is goaltender Chris Driedger. Now, at 27, Driedger has spent most of his professional career in the AHL, with some mixed results, but at least over the last couple of years, he has looked pretty good for the Thunderbirds. Obviously, the Springfield Thunderbirds, not Seattle, they play in a different league anyway. Plus, more importantly than looking at the AHL level, over the last couple of years and the chances he's gotten at the NHL level, he's looked very good there as well. Last year, he got into 12 games, starting 11 of those, where he had a save percentage of .938 and a goals against average of 2.05. With especially that save percentage looking very impressive, and he did even get credit for 7 wins in those games. Though, again, goalie wins are a little as a stat, but still, that's pretty good. But again, for a 27-year-old goalie who's spent most of his professional career at the AHL level, 12 games over one season is not a whole lot to go off of if you're looking at a player to pick an expansion. But then he's followed that up this year with a save percentage of .927 in 20 games that he's played, plus a goals against average of 2.09, and for what it's worth, getting credit for 12 wins. So when it comes down to it with the Panthers, even with them having a number of pretty good options when it comes to skaters, I wouldn't hate the Kraken taking a chance on Driedger here. At this point, he still probably is one of the 1B type of goalies that the Kraken could platoon, but he could produce into a very strong goalie if he can keep up the stats that he's had so far to this point. Of course, I still would like to see if he can continue that over the course of the rest of the season, and then whatever he can do potentially in some appearances in the playoffs. At least at this moment right now, I still think the Kraken would probably be better off going for Bennett or Duclair on the forward end, or maybe going for Montour on the defensive end. But the most important thing is there are a number of good players here, and the Panthers can't protect them all, so the Kraken will be probably getting a pretty good player from this team, unless they cut a deal. But when it comes to that, the Panthers don't tend to be one of the teams that has a whole lot of cap issues, and even with the flat cap, this year is no exception to that. Plus, they don't really have any big prohibitive type of contracts that they're going to want out from under in the years coming up, so I don't see a whole lot of incentive for them to cut a deal here unless there really is a couple of guys that they just don't want to have the chance of losing. I don't know that it's really worth thinking about too much because I just don't see it as being all that likely that the Panthers will go that route. With that said though, we have reached the end of this one, so if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Panthers, whether it's a different protection list or who you think the Kraken should select, down in the comments section. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other.